Today I'm talking about Greek word studies, and you should have on the Google Drive or the portal the material for the Greek word studies that I placed there, and I want to go over this with you. Today's lecture is an introduction to word study in terms of theory or concept, and the next time's lecture is over how to do it practically. Okay? So I want to start off with some wrong assumptions about word studies, things not to think about words. Number one, do not assume that a Greek word means exactly the same thing as its English translation. Although an English dictionary is helpful for understanding what a translator meant, the underlying Greek word meaning is more important in determining what God wants to communicate to us. And since the King James was translated over 400 years ago, if you're looking up an English word from the King James, you should use a dictionary that gives meanings of words in the 1600s. Okay? So, a classic example of this is Romans 13, which says, provide all things honest. It says live honestly. And the word honestly in 1611 meant appropriately, and had nothing to do with not telling lies. And you wouldn't know that because honestly is still a common English word, and the only way to know that is by looking up honestly in the Oxford English Dictionary and seeing that. Do not assume every occurrence of an English word is based on the same Greek word. Just because you're seeing mercy or love or grace doesn't mean you're seeing the same word in the original. And just because it was translated with the same English word doesn't mean it necessarily means the same thing. Don't assume a word always means the same thing in every passage. Words have a range of meanings and take on different nuances depending on the context. Why are so many people confused about sanctification? Because they think the word holiness means the same thing every time they see it. Or sanctification means the same thing. Or flesh. The word sarx has at least 4 different senses. The material that covers the bones of a human or animal, the physical body as a functioning entity, the sinful nature, and just the outward side of life. So you have to pay attention to context. Good old context. Do not apply all possible meanings of a word to one passage. This is virtually never correct. Okay? For example, loose can mean something different in loose change, loose woman, and a loose screw. Okay? And you couldn't possibly say that it meant all of those things in one place without having asked the author, and we don't have access to the author. We have to ask the context. And don't assume that every author uses the same word in the same way. For example, Jesus rarely, if ever, uses the word flesh in the sense that Paul does. When Jesus says, the spirit is willing but the flesh is weak, he's not talking about what Paul talks about when he says, if we walk in the flesh. He's just talking about the body. They were tired. Okay, but Paul's flesh has a quasi-spiritual sense that includes the physical as well. So, talk for a moment about how words work. All words have a history. And if you study the meaning of a word through time, that's called a diachronic, or through time study. A diachronic study has value for the study of language history and linguistics, and the Oxford English Dictionary is the most comprehensive dictionary for this kind of study. In it, we can find that the word nice in English meant stupid in the 14th century, and fine or precise in the 17th century, and now it means something like pleasant. So, in contrast to a diachronic study, is a study of a word's meaning at a given period of time. That's called synchronic study. The Greek language has gone through a lot of different stages: Linear B, Classical, Cuneic, Patristic, perhaps even medieval and modern. The New Testament was written in Cuneic or Common Greek, and you have to look at Cuneic usage, not Classical or not modern, or to understand the New Testament. Just like it would be illegitimate to say that nice in the sentence "it's a nice day" means stupid, because it could mean stupid in the 14th century, it would be wrong to use classical Greek meanings to interpret the New Testament. And yet, many older commentaries, so people writing in the 1500s and 1600s who didn't have much access to anything besides classical Greek, often use their understanding of classical Greek to interpret the New Testament, when that wasn't necessarily the meanings at that time. Another example would be like reading a book from the early 1900s which uses the word gay and claiming that the author was talking about homosexual, when gay didn't have that meaning in the early 1900s. Beware of writers who say that because a Greek word originally meant X, or the root meaning of X is. I see that all the time, and they're almost always wrong. Not about the root meaning, but about what it means in the passage. Okay? So, I remember my Hebrew prof giving us an example from English. Where does the word buck in the sentence, "he's passing the buck," come from? Or "don't pass the buck"? Well, you look it up in a language dictionary, it turns out that it comes from a male deer. And a buck's horn was used as a knife handle in the ancient West, and when you were playing cards, in order to find out who dealt, they would pass the buck. And when somebody didn't pass the buck, then they would deal the cards. But what's that got to do with our meaning when we say "don't pass the buck"? Nothing. We just mean don't pass the responsibility on to somebody else, and we're not thinking about knives or male deer horns or playing cards. Okay? So the etymology or history of a word's development has no necessary bearing on its current usage or meaning. Only occasionally, and actually Spiros Zodhiates, who does have a fairly popular keyword Greek New Testament, is the only person I know of who reads modern Greek meanings back into the New Testament. So beware of anything by Spiros Zodhiates. Not that everything he says is wrong, but anytime he does that, he's off the beam. Yes.
So what about like the majority of the commentaries in Shmuel?
All of those are going to, I mean, we have them there because they do legitimate stuff.
Right, that's what I was going to say.
But most of your popular Christian, so I'm reading a book, Raising a Modern Day Knight, and the guy said, Proverbs 17, I think it's verse 16, says that grandsons are the crown of old men, and the glory of sons is their father. And the root meaning of the word glory is weight or weightiness. And the idea here is that fathers are what provide the stability or the weight for a son. Okay. Well, number one, it's true that the root meaning of the word kavod in Hebrew means weight, but it's not true that that means that the use of the word glory refers to weightiness. Besides, you didn't read the Hebrew, and kavod doesn't show up in the verse at all. It's a totally different Hebrew word. It has absolutely nothing to do with weightiness. It just means beauty, or that which gives attractiveness to. So, when people make appeals to root meanings, you can just about always be sure that they're off the beam.
Especially when it's like English books, not just
even a commentary. No commentator should appeal to a root meaning unless the word doesn't occur frequently enough for us to know what it means contextually, which is very infrequent in Greek. More common in Hebrew, but not as much in Greek. So when doing a synchronic study, keep in mind the possibility that older meanings may still linger in usage. Okay, so having said everything I said there, you can't act as though the word doesn't have a history. So, is it possible that Paul uses a word with its older sense? Yeah. But it's context that ought to give us a clue. Okay, so we sing, "'Tis the season to be jolly, don we now our gay apparel, fa la la la," and we're singing it in the 21st century, and even though the normal meaning of gay in the 21st century has to do with homosexual, in that particular song, it retains its old meaning. Okay? So you have to be sensitive to that possibility as well. Now, words may have more than one meaning. The sense of a word, and that's a technical word, sense, is its meaning in a specific context. And a word may have multiple senses. This is called polysemy, or multi-sense. The usage of a word teaches you its senses. And I gave an example earlier with flesh. The senses of flesh. Okay, they ate the flesh off the bone. My flesh is weak. Don't make provision for the flesh. And we are not in the flesh if we are in Christ. All those are different senses. Okay. Now, we need to distinguish between what's called sense and reference. When working with nouns, and adjectives would be included, it's important to distinguish these two things. The noun animal is a very general word that has as its primary sense any living organism other than a plant or bacterium that's not a human. Okay. The noun animal, however, has many thousands of referents. Dog, pig, horse, giraffe, zebra, lion, duck. Okay. If you were studying the word animal, you would distinguish between its sense, what it means, and what it refers to. Okay. I can say, look at that animal, and point at a pig, but the word animal doesn't mean pig. Okay. Nouns can be graded from very specific terms to quite general terms. The more general a noun is, the more reference it is likely to have. The more specific a noun is, the fewer reference it has. A technical term may have only one referent. As far as I know, the word electron has only one referent, although they'll probably name a car an electron, and that'll change that. Is there a car type called an electron yet that you know of? Okay. So, right now an electron is a charged particle that revolves around an atom, and that's the only thing we use that word for. Questions about what I've said so far? All right, so let me talk about suggestions for effective word studies. There are several levels of context that affect a word's meaning. Sentence, paragraph, book, author's corpus, the whole New Testament or Old Testament, the Septuagint, non-biblical writings of the era. These contexts affect the meaning of a word in a given sentence in decreasing order of influence. The sentence is the most important, non-biblical writings the least important. Okay. Unless, of course, Paul's quoting a non-biblical writer like he does in Acts when he quotes from Epimenides, in which case understanding what Epimenides meant in his sentence will help us probably understand why Paul was quoting him. A native ancient speaker of Greek would have been aware probably unconsciously, of the shades of meanings from the word usage in his culture. Bible and theological dictionaries give you some of this broader background on word meaning and culture. So that's why you ought to make use of those tools. The immediate context and the author's own personal usage habits are always the most important factors in determining word meaning. So when you do a word study, try to understand how the word is used in each passage. Then look for a context similar to the passage you are studying. This will help you determine the exact shade of meaning in a particular passage. A lexicon is created by studying how a word is used in every available passage. So, I'm reading a book, From Heaven He Came and Sought Her, on definite atonement, Calvinist doctrine that Christ died only for the elect. And one of the common arguments that is made in favor of the belief in efficacious grace is that the verb draw that occurs in John 6:44, no man can come to me unless the Father draw him, always indicates an effectual drawing, a drawing that necessarily accomplishes its intent. So, if you want to evaluate that claim, then you go look at all the occurrences of the verb elkuo in the New Testament. The rich draw the poor before the judgment seat. Okay. Fisherman draws fish to his net, in his net. I've forgotten the other ones, but one of them is Jesus said, if I be lifted up, I will draw all men to me. Now, if you insist on a efficacious drawing, then you have to say that either Christ will save all men, or that all doesn't mean all men, it means something like all kinds of men I will draw to myself. But the other option is to say, well, halkuo may mean an effectual drawing when it's talking about fish in a net, but just because a rich man took a poor man to court doesn't mean the rich man will necessarily win. Okay, so there's nothing that's necessarily effective about the word there, and neither is it necessarily effective in John 12, where he says, I will draw all men to myself. Okay, so the skill I'm teaching you is really important for theological evaluation as well as exegesis. Now, synonyms, another aspect of language, is the area of synonymity. Synonyms are words with the same basic meaning but slightly different nuances. Actually, you could think of two circles, and if the circles touch but don't overlap, they aren't synonyms, but they are closely related terms. If they overlap to any degree, then they're synonyms, and you can have 100% overlap, which is pretty rare in any language, and more or less degrees of overlap. Okay. The reason 100% overlap's rare is words fall out of use if they mean exactly the same thing. Okay. A careful study of related words can help you distinguish the exact shade of meaning in a passage. Now, you say, how do I find synonyms? Well, you can consult Low and Nida, which is in BibleWorks, and it lists word by semantic domains and puts synonyms and antonyms together so that you can see them. Thayer's Lexicon, which is also free in BibleWorks, sometimes lists synonyms at the end of its entry for a given word. New Testament authors use synonyms for three basic reasons. One, to identify two similar but distinguishable meanings. So Paul says, put off all anger, wrath. And what's the difference between anger and wrath? And why does he say both anger and wrath? It seems like he's making a difference since he goes on to say other things, malice and so on. The second use of synonyms is for emphasis or effect. It's a horrible, very bad, no good, awful, terrible day. Well, that's effect. And I think that's what James is doing when he says that you may be perfect, complete, lacking nothing. And the third option is for literary variety. You ever get tired of saying the same word and you just want a different word? Okay. Well, the King James is a good example of this in 1 John 2:24. Let that which you heard abide in you. If that which you heard remains in you, then you shall continue in the Son and the Father. They use abide, remain, continue, and it's the exact same Greek word in the original all three times. Literary variety. A preacher who made a distinction between abide and continue and remain would be misreading the King James text. Okay. Now, here's another example. John 21. Peter, do you love me? Peter, do you love me? Peter, do you love me? Love's the same word in English, but you get agapao in Greek and phileo in Greek. Agapasma, philisma. So, what is Jesus doing? Is he using it sense number one? He has two senses of love, or is this just emphasis the three times, and that the variety is purely literary? Or maybe Jesus wasn't even talking Greek at all. He was speaking in Aramaic, and John is translating Aramaic. And John's preference is for literary variety. He just got tired of saying agapas. And you can say it'd be the same word in Aramaic all three times. Right? You got to consider options like this as you evaluate what's going on. And it's interesting to me that agapao and phileo are not the only two synonyms in the passage. That Jesus uses sheep and lambs, and he uses feed and shepherd, and then John talks about fish that were caught and brought to land and eaten, and he uses three different words to refer to the fish. And when you pull all of that data together, it starts looking like John just has a penchant for literary variety. Okay. And we've all heard sermons about John 21 that made a play one way or another on this exchange in terms. Okay. Cognate words. You need to know what a cognate is. A cognate is a part of speech that comes from the same root. So, philos, friend, and phileo, right, and Philadelphia. Okay, all of these are words that are related to or cognates. You can find cognates by looking them up in the Theological Dictionary of the New Testament, because it lists all New Testament cognates together in the same place. Okay, I want to wrap up here with a quick discussion of Greek lexicons. BDAG, Bauer, Danker, Arndt, and Gingrich, the four authors who worked on it. Bauer being the first and most formative, Danker being the most recent, Arndt and Gingrich later. Earlier, but not as influential as Danker. This is the standard authoritative lexicon of the New Testament. Okay? It's not in BibleWorks free. You have to pay for it. It costs $120. It's a lot of money, but there's no substitute for it. Okay? It is the only one that does what it's trying to do. Okay? It not only gives usage in the New Testament and the Septuagint and Apostolic Fathers, but looks at Q&A literature as well as classical literature on those terms. Freiberg's lexicon, it's a good lexicon. It's a first-rate work. Okay, it's free, and that's a blessing. So you've got access to that. I would say that's the best place for beginners, which is where you're at, to start. Lohennida is not exhaustive, but attempts to take all the vocab of the New Testament and break it up into the areas of language called semantic domains, and then list all the words that fit those areas of language. So it's a different way of looking at how words relate. Thayer was quite the scholar, and no need to denigrate his scholarship. It's just that a lot of things have been discovered since the 1800s. Okay, and sometimes he's out of date because of that. The United Bible Society Concise Greek-English Dictionary, which is in Bible Works, under the title UBS, I think. It's a modern and generally accurate lexicon, but it doesn't show the effect of context on word meaning. It doesn't give the sense, give you a sense of the relative frequency of various meanings. If you get just a list of senses, how do you know which one occurs only one time and which occurs 80 times? Okay, and it looks like you can just say eeny, meeny, miny, mo. I like this one. But that's why you need a sense of how frequently a given sense occurs. Okay. Liddell and Scott's Intermediate Classical Greek Lexicon gives you access to a classical Greek lexicon. It's good, but it's not complete. It's free in Bible Works as well. Strong's. Everybody's heard of Strong's. Strong's was a Methodist scholar, a good scholar, but again, working with both outdated linguistic approaches to words as well as access to data. I don't recommend that you use Strong's ever, really, unless you have absolutely nothing else to look at. Okay. And then, anytime you look at Strong's, don't pay attention to what he says about the root, okay? Because that's not what counts. It's usage. You all have purchased Bible Works. You can do your own word search. You can look at all the occurrences of a lemma in the New Testament and or the Septuagint, or both. There's no need to rely solely on a lexicon. Why do I use a lexicon? Well, I use lexicons because I don't want to act as though my analysis of the word is the only one that counts. I pay attention to what other people have done as well. If my conclusions are radically different than theirs, then I need to be able to show why theirs are wrong, or see, what's and justify my own, or the other way around. There are a number of theological dictionaries. Kittle's. It's still valuable for the data it brings together, but its conclusions about theology are mostly liberal, and its linguistic methodology was exposed to be a monstrous regiment of shoddy scholarship, as James Barr said in his 1970s book on the semantics of biblical language. He pretty much scuttled that whole 10-volume set with his one book. Other books are listed here, and then I give additional works on word study. Moise Silva's God, Language, and Scripture is a good one. His biblical words and their meaning is probably where I would recommend somebody starting for moving beyond what I'm doing for you here. Okay. All right, our time's up, and we will go over the word study methodology, and I will give an example of that next time. You're dismissed.